Watch a movie, get inspired, give back, help a charity. It's time for a movie karma watch party.
Welcome everybody to another Movie Karma Watch Party. My name is Jared Milrad. Movie Karma is a place where people can watch inspiring movies and take action to support their favorite charities and filmmakers all around the world. We touch on a host of causes, environmental, social causes, and many others. And we recognize films every month through our Show for Change Film Festival. And this month, we're really excited to recognize an amazing filmmaker, an amazing film, a very timely project directed by Kenton Card, who brought us Geographies of Racial Capitalism. So Kenton, wanted to welcome you to the watch party, and thanks for sharing your film with us.
Thank you very much.
Absolutely. So we're going to dive in and screen the film, and then we'll do a Q&A in the back end. So let's get started. Again, Kenton, thanks for sharing your film with us. For folks who just joined, feel free to submit questions to Kenton, and we'll get to as many as we can, or comment is fine too. We'll get to as many as we can. So first of all, Kenton, could you just give us, first of all, congrats on the film. Thanks for sharing it with us again. But I would love to hear a little bit more about your background. So I'm really curious how this project came to be and how you, as a PhD candidate, came to make this.
Thanks. I just want to give a little shout out. Thanks, Emma and Janice, and my sister Katie's on. So thanks to some people, some family, some of my community. Yeah, I'm a PhD student candidate at UCLA and in urban planning, and I think it's when you're in the university and you're grappling with some of the challenging questions around capitalism or inequality and racism, patriarchy, I think I'm constantly thinking about how to communicate with broader audiences and how to kind of communicate outside of these narrow channels. And so film has always been a way to kind of challenge that and to operate outside of. So this film wasn't like my conception. It was really the Antipode Foundation, which is a foundation connected to an academic journal called Antipode, a journal of radical geography. And they came to me and they went to Brett Story, and Brett Story directed a film on David Harvey, and I directed a film on Ruth Wilson Gilmore, and that was like a tremendous honor, I have to say, because she's a fantastic, brilliant activist, scholar, model. So,
yeah, and let's hear more about that in terms of why and how Ruth came to be the center of the film. And if you could also just unpack for folks, including me, you mentioned radical geography and some of the work that you're studying from an academic perspective. I wonder if you could just unpack that a little bit too, in terms of what that might mean to folks. I think the film does a good job of how it can touch us in real ways, but if you could add to that, it'd be great.
Yeah. So, I think when people think of geography, they often think of just like maps or boundaries. And I think Dr. Gilmore has some very compelling articulation about it being a kind of dedication to space and an intensity to understanding social relationships and how they are spatialized. And that's one of the ways. So you can think about economic spatialization, economic geography. How do various economies? You can think about gender, race, etc., through the lens of geography. So critical geography is one field that that has a different intellectual tradition than, say, sociology or anthropology. Dr. Gilmore is a fairly unique character. She just last year, I believe it was 2019, won the Lifetime Achievement Award for the American Association of Geographers. I believe she's also been the president of the American Studies Association, and she's a professor of geography and American Studies at the City University of New York. She was a non-traditional graduate student. She had for many years been an organizer in Los Angeles, for prison abolition. She taught actually at UCLA for a period of time in the urban planning department as an adjunct. And at that time began to question, should she go, she almost stayed in urban planning at UCLA, but she decided to go to work with Neil Smith, a prominent Marxist geographer. That actually, he's a student of David Harvey, another prominent Marxist economic geographer. So I think she brings a really unique and fascinating approach to geography because she is a through and through organizer and tied to intimate relationships and communities, and then has a compelling, complex political economy of racial capitalism critique within her work. And I think that's where her book, her very important award-winning book, Golden Gulag, I'm not going to get the subtitle right, so I have it here, Prisons, Surplus, Crisis, and Opposition in Globalizing California, is very important because it has this big, deep political economy as a kind of Marxist approach to these institutions, but also is fundamentally a critique of racial capitalism and racial categories therein. So Antipode is looking for, leading geographers that are pushing the field, and Dr. Gilmore is absolutely pivotal in that as a leader and a model in that way. So
yeah, I mean, given her status as you said, kind of a unique leader in that space, how did film come to be as the medium that you went with? Because I think it is interesting. I mean, my brother's an academic. I know that he writes and researches all the time, as I'm sure you do, and will write stuff in journals all the time. I don't know that film would come to his brain as a medium to use for this type of topic. So how did that happen? And do you feel like you were able to accomplish what you wanted to in using film as a medium?
Yeah, it's a bit, I have been involved in film for a long time, and I've always had this drive to interview folks on film, and I have, with mixed success, made little, collections of films. I think really the resources that Antipode was willing to put in to this allowed me to kind of hire some folks, with deeper ties to film and then a broader set of skills, so I could kind of focus on, with Dr. Gilmore, like the content. I mean, the content is Dr. Gilmore's. I'm just sort of like trying to kind of like fit it into this, it was supposed to be 12 or 10 minutes and, it's 16, which we kept whittling down. But film becomes, of course, a medium to kind of communicate visually, to communicate through story, to communicate, more broadly beyond. I mean, there are other films that Dr. Gilmore's featured in, and obviously on this topic, and there's many interviews and there's many, many writings, and I'll mention some later. But I think that a lot of people have been able to watch it. I think that's connected to kind of the desire to understand these topics in these pressing times, and Dr. Gilmore's been a long leader in that.
Right. Yeah, and we're glad you chose film as a medium. We feel the same way about it. We had a good question here from Daniela about, will you make a full-length feature out of this? I'm curious, on top of that question, I'm personally a big fan of short films for a number of reasons. So I'm curious as to, within the genre, within the space of medium of film, why you chose to make a short, if that was just the constraints, as you said, that you got, and or do you think that a feature would be something of interest to you that you want to do?
Yeah. I think a short clearly provides an opportunity for more folks online as we have this kind of increasingly digital way in which folks consume media. So that form fits well. There's I really pushed Dr. Dr. Gilmore and I, we had many, many hours of conversations all over Lisbon, and she lives in Lisbon. She teaches in New York, and her major early contributions empirically and theoretically on the prison industrial complex were the fact that California had the largest prison boom in the history of the world. It's very important to think about this liberal state, right? For a very long time. We had the 3 strikes rule, we begin to, and there's so many of those nuances that are in more of the interviews, and I think there's a tension there. I would like to be able to, I would like to work toward maybe potentially releasing the transcript, but Dr. Gilmore has many other works that go into this depth, other writings, other colleagues of hers. She has a book coming out with Haymarket Press called Change Everything, Racial Capitalism and the Case for Abolition, 2021. So I would, encourage folks to look for that. This film scrapes the surface. It's just a couple of days talking with her. There's so much material that's more on point than this, that she's drawing on, that she's in dialogue with, that other folks are pioneering, especially in these very dramatic, moments after Mr. Floyd's death. This is a moment of heightened intensity, and we can talk about that later. I know you have some other questions, but just there are other leaders out there. So the resources, Antipode and Dr. Gilmore, I think the circumstance is not that I'm going to make a feature from this, but I'm glad that we were able to be part of this kind of historic moment in a little way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the short works, I think Katie commented that she agreed with it being a short. I would love a longer version though, with lots of editing. So that is certainly true. A lot of work would go into a longer piece. Could we dive in a little bit, maybe scrape a little bit beneath the surface, Ken, in terms of some of the topics that you brought to the fore in the film? Because I think there's a lot there, and I thought you did a nice job of giving us a taste of each of them in a short film, structure. Number one, if you could unpack a little bit for us racial capitalism. I thought, Dr. Gilmore did a really nice job of discussing how those two are tied together, perhaps inextricably. But could you unpack that a little bit more, and how that is connected to some of the other themes, in prison industrial complex? If you could give us a little bit of those interconnections too.
Yeah, I'm gonna answer in 1 sec. I forgot. Yeah. There's another intention around the film. It's meant to be, the bill from Antipode was, how do we illustrate Dr. Gilmore's research and pedagogy, or the main topics? And so Dr. Gilmore's like, I want to unpack my pedagogy. I want to unpack racial capitalism, and I want to unpack abolition geography. And so we start with these buckets, and I'm like, 10 minutes? How are we gonna do this? And there's more, there are one, I think, connection Dr. Gilmore draws. So she is working within what we think of as the Black radical tradition. And you can read more contemporary folks, like Dr. Gilmore, like Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor, like Robin D.G. Kelley, but many of these folks are drawing on Cedric Robinson, 1983, wrote a book called Black Marxism. And in that, he challenges the Marxist tradition through 3 prominent Black intellectuals, but he challenges that the European left claims that it has the most radical kind of critique of capitalism. And so these folks are saying, no, we need to understand inequality as not only class, but it's racialized, right? And so the early term slave is rooted in the word Slavic. And so it has this internal European perspective that we later think of, right, these folks as all white, and race being, or Black, and this kind of, and ultimately, no, that's not the argument. The argument being made here in a racial capitalism critique is that race is a tool to divide by those with power. And I think an important point is that racialism is older than capitalism. Race as a dividing feature is older. We live in a time of capitalism, of private property, of the rules of the market as an exchange with forms of regulation, but that's why the critique is now targeted on racial capitalism.
Right. It's very centered in present day. And why did you feel that Lisbon brought, in particular, and going there, brought that to the fore? Like, did you feel like the geography and the place literally was like a great way to kind of elucidate some of those concepts?
Yeah, I mean, it would have been a very different film if we would have shot it in California, you know, looking at some of the networks, and we may have had more time with different networks of activists and so forth. I think what that allowed, of course, as I hope is obvious, right, is that you have these totems to colonization that that we fetishize endlessly, these narratives of discovery. And that became a kind of backdrop, right? But trying to ultimately then also juxtapose to forms of consumption locally in Lisbon, not just tourist consumption, but other forms and forms of resistance in Cova de Moura.
Right.
I mean, something that's complex, that made shooting this complex, is that Cova de Moura is a fetishized excerpt of Lisbon. And I studied in Lisbon almost a decade ago for 6 weeks. And students then actually did what Mike Davis might call like a poverty pornography, like, oh, look at how bad it is in Cova de Moura, because people flock there to look at these incredible murals. And so I think it was really hard to, how do we shoot in this space? That's why we don't have more people, because we're dealing with the complex relationship of being Americans, coming to this neighborhood. We are not trying to represent it as needing, because it is really struggling in its own way for liberation and protection to prevent itself from being displaced. And so ultimately we focused on Dr. Gilmore. We focused on her relationship to Flavio, and this kind of dialogue they have over these pop-up universities and what resistance looks like.
Right, in that context and that place. Could you talk a little bit about how the prison industrial complex fits in here? I mean, obviously there's some obviously it fits in, as Dr. Gilmore talks about, but I'm also curious to get your thoughts on, you know, literally the last few weeks of discussion I feel like we've been having as a state and a country around prisons and criminal justice, not only related to George Floyd and the killings of Black folks, particularly Black men, but also the early releases of some individuals who were convicted of nonviolent offenses. California has released, I think, a growing number of people early because of the pandemic. So how does that all sit with you in the context of the themes of the film? What's happening now to the prison industrial complex?
So I think, number one, for I think there's a lot, you just mentioned a lot. I just had a lot of things go up in my head.
Yeah, I figured pick any piece there.
No, I mean, I think what Dr. Gilmore and abolitionists are doing in saying we need to abolish the prison, in what we've seen over the last weeks, we need to abolish police. And Dr. Gilmore, in the longer form interview, I mean, acknowledges, or in a way, that this is a pedagogical choice to disrupt your standard frame of thinking about the world and toward thinking about alternatives. I was, a couple weeks after George Floyd died, I was in a Whole Foods and I have my mask on and I lower my mask to take a bite of pizza. And I put the mask back on, and an armed security guard came up to me. And I'm not Black. I mean, why do people with guns respond to all of these things? Why don't folks question calling the police on minor incidents? So there's a long legacy of organizing that has led to the stopping of expanding the prison system in California, in beginning to challenge folks like Jackie Lacey in Los Angeles, right, that hasn't prosecuted killer cops, right? And we need to, on the local level, connect to local Black Lives Matter chapters. other chapters, I have some like folks listed we can talk about, but the contemporary movement to challenge the institution of the police, in brutal terms, I think it's kind of a slavery moment of our time, where it is so invisible to so much of the white population. What? Police are fine? No. Like for Black and brown folks, for many Asian communities that have been interned, Chinese Californians that were also killed, no, the police have long served as a violent institution, and we do not, that doesn't mean there are no domestic folks with guns, but it means completely reconsidering what social services we need, why we pour so much budget into this, completely transforming what community accountability looks like.
Yeah.
And so I think there's the point is that there's a long legacy, of fuck the police. This is a lyrics in songs. This is this is slogans in movements, and it is peaking up in the current movement for Black lives. But there's a long legacy, and there's many people to learn from, I guess, in this space and get involved in challenging whether your prosecutor holds police accountable or not.
Right, and I think one thing that struck me to back to the relevance of the film to this moment is when Dr. Gilmore mentioned the abolition movements, which to me is just another, in part saying, as you pointed out, defund the police. Like that is part and parcel, it seems, of that concept and of that movement. What do you feel like? And you mentioned a few actions or alluded to a few actions and a few organizations you feel like people might want to look into or support. What types of actions or lessons do you want people to take away from the film beyond what you've already mentioned? Is there something specific that stands out to you?
Yeah, I think a lot of folks need to listen to the movement. They need to I think most of us need to educate ourselves. Reading Ruth Wilson Gilmore, reading Angela Davis, Are Prisons Obsolete? Kimberly Crenshaw, focusing on how so often we think of police victims as Black men, when Black women are equally targeted and carrying the burden of fatherless households. Keeanga Yamada Taylor, Robin Kelly, drawing connections between not only race and gender, but class. So I think there's so many ways that we can educate ourselves, but there's local groups, there's local Black Lives Matters chapters, and folks should donate money, a percentage maybe. There's mutual aid organizations. I want to plug People for People Los Angeles. They're doing mutual aid. They have hundreds of volunteers. You pay money. They're just delivering groceries. Critical Resistance is a group Angela Davis and Ruth Wilson Gilmore, among others, co-founded, which is a movement to abolish the prison industrial complex. So, I think educating yourselves, being aware of local organizations, and voting, obviously. Angela Davis is like, I'm for Biden. Biden co-wrote, the crime bill. He's not ideal, but we live in a pragmatic world. We live in a world bound by these institutions. And so if you think you're more radical than the start by voting. So, vote, donate resources, donate time, and educate yourself and challenge your own family and community on how they think about race, privilege, that being colorblind is actually like complicity with your own benefits in the system. We need to go beyond that, right? And interrogate our racialism.
Right. Yeah. And there are so many resources, of which you mentioned many, to do that, and authors who write on that topic. Are there policy outcomes? You mentioned a couple, but I'm wondering if there are specific policy outcomes you feel are either achievable or important as we think about this election and beyond, connected to the film that you believe in or you think we should be considering.
Yeah, I mean, I would just, I think the current movement to remove resources from the police. I mean, it's very exciting that we see cities saying, okay, we are going to literally remove the idea of this being a police department because it's non-reformable. And then we are going to reconsider through community process, what does community accountability look like? So the policy proposal is defund and refund. Let's reallocate those resources to healthcare, to childcare, to housing, to help, you know, I mean, et cetera. So I think that's, I think, the number one, and listening to local community groups resisting.
Right. Do you feel, as part of the defund police movement, I know there's been some debate in some circles, I think conservative circles, but others, about terminology and phrasing, that defund, and perhaps even the Biden campaign has been saying some of this, which is that defund is not a helpful term, that it can be misleading to people, that it should be something closer to reallocation, transformation, etc. I'm wondering, as someone who, you know, is an academic and I'm sure looks at language a lot, what are your thoughts on that discussion or debate?
I think, you know, like, I feel like Cornel West is an interesting case here because, like, he allies with Bernie Sanders, was a big supporter of Bernie Sanders, but he said, you know, once Bernie, you know, he had to push Bernie Sanders a lot to the left, especially on international issues. I think folks in movements and academics can play a role here, have to think about the horizon of the possible. They have to look farther, right? And they need to look toward abolition. They need to look toward it. People weren't saying, oh, well, let's like count slaves a little bit more. Let's give them better breaks. And we know we haven't given reparations to folks. So these institutions are so deeply historical and systemic. So I think we absolutely need the rhetoric of abolition as an ultimatum, as a kind of full force vision. And simultaneously, there's going to be negotiations because, like supporting Biden and pushing Biden farther left, for instance, you know, and it's a very exciting moment where we're going to begin to have case studies of cities that try to reconstitute what police means. And will folks in the 22nd century look back to the 21st and say, wow, they still had police where everyone had guns, all, you know, and clearly we're not like going to go to a gunless domestic force because of the context of folks having a lot of weapons in this country. But that doesn't mean that you can't have, you know, different community members, different trained health professionals, social workers coming when you need support. So I think the language is essential, and I think that doesn't mean that's the only lane, right? You have to kind of operate in many lanes in different registers to make social change. It's not linear. There's no like button to press.
Yeah, there's not. I wish there was, right? On that note, and sort of a few more questions here. We obviously at Movie Karma believe a lot in storytelling. We feel like storytelling can spur people to action. You've mentioned a bunch of actions that people can take. I'm wondering what your thought is on maybe this film in particular, but more broadly, how storytelling can spur action, or can it? Do you feel like it is a tool for people to do something tangible, or is it more a perception shifting tool, or both? What is your take on that?
I mean, I think we need to, you know, folks need to challenge their consciousness. Folks need to challenge their default setting. And so we have, Katie's saying both. Yeah, no, of course. It's like we have to use the newspaper. We have to use the academic, you know, channel. I mean, and the academic institution is deeply fraught with racial, economic hierarchy, gender hierarchies, right? I mean, it's a very conservative institution, just as the political, you know, the political structure is. So I think film and story provide a channel to connect with people through the internet. That the short form does that well. making these kind of complex systems like political economy, racial capitalism, abolition, geography, trying to break these down. I think film can try to do that. I mean, I hope we kind of, you know, we're able to boil some of that down.
Yeah, I think you were. And again, if folks have questions, we'll probably wrap them soon, so feel free to submit them. Katie mentioned storytelling connects emotions, which drive many people and entice discussion. I agree. I think that's why we're here today. Wanted to just get a sense, Ken, are there other projects you're working on, that folks should look out for? Are you thinking of becoming a filmmaker full time, or is this just more of a one-off project? What's up next?
You know, my dissertation is on the housing crisis. I look at housing movements in Los Angeles and Berlin, Germany. So I'm gonna, at some point, try to fundraise and hopefully pull a team together to make a film about why in the most progressive state, arguably in the country, a very wealthy state, a very liberal state, why does kind of homelessness continue to rise? Why can't we regulate the housing market, support renters? And again, this is tied to racist institutions. So I'm interested in making a project around that. There's also, you know, Janice Dutton is on the line. I'm working with her and chatting with her a bit about doing a film about the late great Tom Dutton, an architect, radical architect teacher that worked in Over the Rhine, Cincinnati, and that's a really important story locally as an architect, using his professional connections and teaching platform to connect to a local movement there. So those are kind of two projects I have. So
that's neat. Okay, so there is more stuff coming out. Cool. Yeah, we'll love to see it. Well, if there's anything I missed, feel free to chime in. But otherwise, thank you, Ken, so much for doing this. If folks on the line have films of your own you want to submit to our festival, check us out on Film Freeway. Can we see your film? Ken, I think it's online, right? So folks can see the film and check it out at any time.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
Okay. So great. So check out the film if you want to tell your friends about it. Thanks again for doing this.
Thanks so much. It was really fun. And thanks for coming, folks.
Yeah, thanks for everybody being here. All right.
Hey everybody, I'm Jared Milrad, the founder of Movie Karma. Thanks so much for stopping by our page. Make sure to like, subscribe, and share this channel with your friends and family so we can continue to transform entertainment into action.